Welcome to another episode of Healing Through Love. Each week, we share ideas, experiences, and resources to increase the awareness of domestic and family violence and to empower survivors to grow and thrive. We talk with experts who share their advice, or with people who have experienced abuse, no matter where they are on their journey. This is all about healing through love. And now, here are your hosts, Charlene Lynch and Rose Davidson.
The Healing Through Love podcast with host Charlene Lynch and Rose Davidson would love to acknowledge Global Glamping Charities Incorporated for generously supporting this podcast. Global Glamping Charities, solving homelessness in all of its forms. Reach out to them at globalglamping.org. The Healing Through Love podcast with Charlene Lynch and Rose Davidson. There is a misconception that how stressful an event is determines how traumatic an experience is. In episode 60, Sarah Rollins shares how trauma is in the nervous system, not the event.
So in terms of fleeing, that's the run response. Like, I gotta get away. I gotta go. And so that might be activation in the legs, like always kind of shaking or wanting to move the legs. That might be thoughts like, constantly, I got to get out of here. I don't want to be here. Kind of constant thoughts of not really wanting to be present. And then the freeze response is, I'll make this basic because there's a kind of a rigid freeze, and then there's a flaccid or a shutdown freeze. But the freeze is, I have to conserve energy. I have to shut down. I actually might have to play dead because I couldn't fight and I couldn't flee. And so this is my body's chance of staying alive.
The Healing Through Love podcast with Charlene Lynch and Rose Davidson. Hello and welcome to the Healing Through Love podcast. I'm your host, Rose Davidson from rosedavidson.com. Healing Through Love is here to help survivors and victims or victim survivors of domestic and family violence find their way back into living a more fulfilling and meaningful life. We interview experts and survivors who share their personal stories and offer advice to those who have experienced abuse, no matter where they are on their journey. As well as the Healing Through Love podcast, we hold annual Pamper Days in Adelaide in South Australia for survivors of domestic violence. And local businesses come together, they pay it forward by providing their services and resources for the day to give our victim survivors a much-deserved day of indulgence. And we are going global. Yes, we are. So look out for a Pamper Day in your town or city very, very soon. We are always looking for people or organisations with similar values to reach out to us and to offer their time, their services, their resources. And you can reach us at hello@htlaustralia.org. My guest today is Sarah Rollins, and Sarah is going to be talking to us about trauma and how it gets into the nervous system. Now, trauma is in the nervous system. It's not actually in the event. And there is a misconception that how stressful an event is determined by how traumatic the experience will be. So although this is one factor, the event itself is not the only thing that contributes to trauma. And today, Sarah's going to enlighten us on how we can alleviate the impact on us and how it's stored in the body and how we can begin to release it. Sarah, welcome to Healing Through Love podcast. How are you today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I am so interested in learning how we can begin to release all this trauma. But firstly, I'd like to ask you, how did you become a licensed clinical social worker?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. So actually, one of my first pit stops in my career, I wouldn't call it a pit stop, actually, it was really enjoyed my time. I actually worked at a domestic violence shelter in Michigan, which is where I'm from, the States. So I spent about 3 years working in a domestic violence shelter with women and children. And it was one of the most profound experiences that I've had in my journey. So I did that in my undergraduate career. And then I decided this was really what I wanted to do. I was studying psychology, and psychology and social work are very similar. One of the reasons I switched to social work, though, was I wanted to focus on the whole person and a holistic approach rather than just kind of what is wrong and diagnosing someone. And so then I got my graduate degree. And so I've had a couple jobs. And now I've really landed in working with trauma survivors, using the somatic experiencing approach, which is just a nervous system approach to healing trauma.
Yeah, so I guess, what's the difference between the somatic approach and just the everyday, approach to trying to heal trauma? Because I know when I've been to psychologists, they want me to relive the whole experience, and I don't want to go back to reliving. I mean, it's bad enough that I've got, complex PTSD as it is, and I have these, random, thoughts come up all the time. And so I don't want to go back through therapy and relive all of the stuff that's happened to me. And so what's the difference?
Such an amazing question. And I think what you're mentioning right now is such a common experience. So there are many differences. One of the main differences is just that we don't require you to go back and relive everything that you've been through. One of the things that I always say is that you're reliving it enough in your own experience that we don't need you to go back in therapy and do it again. If you want to, of course, you can. We're never here as somatic experience practitioners or somatic therapists to say what you can and cannot say. That is not what we're here for. Of course, we're here to give you choice and space in therapy. But one of the major aspects of somatic therapy that's different is that we don't require you to, one, go through it all or even remember, because sometimes one of the impacts of trauma is that we don't always remember events that's happened to us. And that's a self-protection response. It's a survival response. And so some people come to me and say, this happened a long time ago, maybe when I was a child, or this happened more recently and I can't remember. And so does that mean I can't heal? And I say, absolutely not. So just because we cognitively or consciously can't remember doesn't mean we can't heal, because kind of what we're going to talk about is the body remembers, the body keeps score.
It does. And, I've been diagnosed with a few mental illnesses because of the trauma that I experienced as a child and growing up, into my 20s even. So, it's really hard. And I would love to learn how I can release some of that trauma in places like my back, my lower back. When I get really stressed, I really get a sore back. And I've got fibromyalgia, and I'd love to have some way to learn how to release that, because it is quite a painful, it is classified as a disease now. So, but it is to do with a lot of your nervous system. It's not firing correctly. So, yeah, I'd love to learn how I can, get over all that. I've tried meditation. It certainly doesn't work for me. So, yeah, I don't know what else I can do. I'm out of options.
Yeah, and we hear that all the time. People come to me all the time saying, I've tried traditional talk therapy, I've tried all these modalities, and it's not like they've done nothing for me, but I still feel like it's trapped in my body, or I still feel like I need more healing. And so what you're saying is, one, really common, is two, also why I got into this work, because for me, I knew cognitively, so in my thoughts, in my mind, certain things, but I still was having body responses. So, I'll give you a few examples of things that people have come to me for. So people sometimes say, I have a really big startle response, like I'm very jumpy or I'm very hyper vigilant. Like it feels like I'm kind of like always looking over my shoulder, even though in my mind, I know everything's okay. And so with traditional talk therapy, of course, there's benefits to it. And I'm not here to diss any therapy. I think that every therapy has amazing benefits, but I always say one size never fits all. So what can happen is we can know logically, okay, I'm safe, or there's no one out to get me, or there's no one behind me. But what our trauma can do is it can feel like our body feels like, okay, maybe the threat came from behind. So it feels like we're always having to check. It feels like it's in our bodies that there's this movement that needs to be completed. So what we do in somatic work is, and I'm going to say this big term and then I'll parse it down. So as we work with incomplete self-protection responses. And when I first heard that term, I was like, what the heck? That feels so big. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what that means. So what that means is incomplete fight, incomplete flight, which is the run response, and incomplete freeze. There's also some other ones, but we're going to stick with those basics. And I think a lot of people may or may not have heard of at least fight or flight. So the fight response is wanting to maybe hurt someone, right? Or hurt something. And as I do this with my hands, that's maybe one way that we engage in our fight response, but it could be other things. It could be clenching our jaw. It could be tightening our body. And so that's where some of tension and pain can come from. And we're just going to get curious about it. Obviously, I don't know you. I just met you a nice, ripe 16 minutes ago. But what I get curious about is when someone has pain, I get curious about what is going on in terms of their self-protection responses that may not be complete. So in terms of fleeing, that's the run response. Like, I got to get away. I got to go. And so that might be activation in the legs, like always kind of shaking or wanting to move the legs. That might be thoughts like constantly, I got to get out of here. I don't want to be here. Kind of constant thoughts of not really wanting to be present. And then the freeze response is, I'll make this basic because there's a kind of a rigid freeze, and then there's a flaccid or a shutdown freeze. But the freeze is, I have to conserve energy. I have to shut down. I actually might have to play dead because I couldn't fight and I couldn't flee. And so this is my body's chance of staying alive. So these are ways that our body actually tries to protect us. And even if we're alive now, even if we've gotten out of the threat, it doesn't mean the self-protection response is complete, which that confused me. I was like, but I'm alive. Like, I'm not in the threat anymore. So how can I still have fight in me? And so the way that happens is maybe even though I'm alive, which thank goodness, sometimes what can happen is our body wanted to flee or our body wanted to fight, but never got the chance to. And so that's what we explore in somatic work using the tools. And we can kind of do some of that today a little bit. That what might be going on that our body needs to kind of deactivate some of that.
Yeah, it sounds quite logical when you explain it like that, the fight, flight, freeze, because you're right, you freeze because you just you don't think you've got anywhere to go. In fact, because you remember the trauma that happened to you and that you couldn't leave because you were forced to stay there. So Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I would really love you to go through some steps that people can use to, to go through each of those stages. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I always say too is that these nervous system states, the fight, the flight, the freeze, these are not conscious choices. I'm not telling my body, my brain is not telling my body, okay, Sarah, now it's time to fight, or now it's time to flee, or now it's time to freeze. And the reason that's important because sometimes, and I've been in this situation, is I'll have a nervous system response, I'll flee or I'll fight or I'll even freeze. And I don't like that response. I'll feel shame. Why did I freeze? Why did I fight? And the reality is the nervous system only cares about staying alive. So it doesn't consult like what's cool right now or what's in the media or what's socially acceptable. It really only cares about staying alive. And so shame can come up because it can feel like maybe I didn't do the right thing or the socially acceptable thing, but really I did what I needed to do to stay alive. So I just always like to name that because
that's a really great explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the first things I always do with people, and everything is choice, because part of trauma is lack of choice. So in the work that I do, I always make it invitational, and I always, make it so that you are allowed to say no. So I say, I'm an adult, you can say no to, because I know a lot of times we feel like we can't say no. And that takes time sometimes because, especially in domestic violence situations, we weren't able to say no. So one of the first things I do is what's called orienting. And there's other techniques that in different mindfulness-based practices that do this. And I will say it's a little bit different. And would you be willing to orient with me? Would you be willing?
Sure, why not? We'll give it a go.
Okay.
There's nothing like a live person to show you how it's done.
Right. And I'll explain to you first what we're doing, and then you can again say, maybe I don't want to do it, and then I can just demo too. So orienting is using our 5 senses to notice what's pleasant or neutral in our environment. And the reason we want to orient, that's a little bit different than other mindfulness-based practices, is one, we're not using our mind. And 2, what we want to do is we're orienting actually for safety. We're using what's called our neuroception to determine with our bodies, not just with our logical minds, am I safe here? So I'm not going to ask you to think, am I safe here or not? But I just want you to kind of know the background to this.
Yeah.
So if you're willing, we're just going to start with our eyes, using our vision. And I think people can see my space, where your space, they can see this beautiful background. And people can maybe do it on their own, again, if they're willing, if that feels right for them. And so taking as much or as little time as you need to use your eyes to notice anything in your environment that feels pleasant or neutral. How does that sound?
Oh yeah, I've got my plants. That's great.
Yeah. Oh, you found it right away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we take a couple more moments? Because I didn't even get to do it. Is that okay? Okay. So I'm just going to take like a moment because I don't want to take too much time, if that's okay. And I'm just going to look around my space. Yeah. Yeah. So you immediately noticed your plant.
Yeah, they're right in front of me. So yeah, that's why they're there. So I can look at them and gives me they're pleasant. I love plants. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I noticed I have a shelf right here full of books, and they're very colorful, and I like color. Um, and so what I would ask you, and I'm not going to put you on the spot because I've already done that. You're so willing. But I would ask you, and I'll ask myself, and so people can hear, is what do I notice inside as I maybe look at that plant, or look at, there's a salt lamp to my left. And so what do I notice inside? And what I noticed is when I looked and I oriented, I actually took a pretty deep breath and I settled a little. And I didn't even notice that I felt kind of activated. I felt kind of like ramped up. And by doing that, like my body just like a little bit calmed down. So that was just my experience in doing that just for, 5 seconds. So that's something, yeah.
I've got a favorite plant. It's a begonia. I've been nurturing it along for about 2 years, and it's starting to get more leaves on it again. And so, yeah, it makes me happy because it's one of those pretty begonias that got green leaves with red centers in the leaves. So, yeah, I love it.
So nice. Yeah. Yeah, nature can be such a powerful force.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is one thing that I do. And then we connect it to what do I notice inside? And what I mean by that is what are the sensations in my body? And it could be, oh, I took a deep breath, or I noticed a smile on my face. Or it could be, I didn't really notice anything, and that's okay too. So it's just about getting curious about what's happening in my environment. And then as I connect to my environment, the pleasant or neutral, then what happens inside? And sometimes, I don't know about you, but my head likes to come in. Why am I doing this? What am I doing? This is silly. So it's okay to have those thoughts. It's okay to have any emotions that come up. And what we try to do is connect to bodily sensations in somatic work. So that's one technique we use.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. Yeah. I'll have to remember that when I'm feeling a bit, actually my back feels a lot better now. Isn't that odd?
Yeah.
Isn't that odd? Oh, there you go. I like that. It's hard to remember that one. That's a good one. Sarah, thank you for sharing that. That was wonderful. And actually my back is feeling better. Surprisingly enough, just that little exercise. And so, yeah, there we go. Okay, so have you got anything that have you written any books? Have you got a podcast? Any of those things that you'd like to share?
So I do have on my website, I have a guide, 5 steps to releasing trauma and stress in the body. It's just a free download. So there's a lot about fight, flight, and freeze in the download, some of the stuff we talked about today. So if you go on my website, which is embodiedwellnesstherapy.com, you can download that for free. You'll be added to our email list. We don't bombard you by any means, so don't worry about that. And then you'll get that free download. And otherwise, if you ever have questions, unfortunately, we can only treat people in Michigan, but if you ever have questions, how to find somatic therapists, you need resources, I respond to everybody's inquiries on the website. So please reach out, and, we're here to support you in any way we can.
Oh, that's wonderful. Where else can people find you, Sarah?
Yeah, we have LinkedIn, we have Facebook and Instagram. Instagram and Facebook are at embodiedwellnesstherapy.com or Embodied Wellness Therapy. And hopefully you'll put that in the show notes. So
I certainly will. Don't you worry about that.
Great. Yeah. So, we have some blogs about somatic work also, if you have more questions and want to learn more.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think the benefit, I mean, just for that little bit that you did for me, and it was only the beginning of any type of therapy that you can do. It's already just doing something pleasant that gave me a pleasant feeling, unlocked, the soreness in my back, which to me is absolutely amazing. So,
Yeah.
so I need to really de-stress myself more often. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to discuss trauma therapy, because honestly, as a survivor of trauma, and anyone else who's experienced it, I think the treatment would be so beneficial, and there are many more stages. I'm sure that there are, to get through the therapy as a whole. So I encourage people to seek Sarah out on her website and get in touch with her. And if you want to release some of that trauma, then please do. Sarah, thank you so much for today. And I just want to ask you, if you had some advice to give to anyone about anything, what might that be?
Yeah, I would say the biggest advice is, in my 10 years of doing trauma and mental health work, I've never seen anybody get better shaming themselves. So my biggest advice is, even though it can be really hard, we don't get better hating or shaming ourselves. And so, if possible, to be a little bit compassionate towards ourselves and what we're going through and what we're experiencing.
Yeah, that is wonderful advice. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that we'll speak again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Healing Through Love. You can get further resources, see the show notes, or simply reach out to us via our website at htlaustralia.org. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to your company next time on the Healing Through Love podcast.